بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. So inshallah today's class we will continue with our reading of this very lengthy and massive introduction of Shaykh al-Islam Zakaria al-Ansari's Lub al-Usul. I realized that in the end of the last lecture I kind of rushed through causes, al-asbab. So I'm going to actually begin with the causes to do that justice. So we're going to talk about causes and conditions and preventions. And these are considered al-ahkam al-wad'iyya, the rulings, unlike the sharia rulings of the haram, the wajib, mubah, mandub, makruh, etc. These are things that have been established. So some things have been established as a cause for a ruling, some things are established as a condition for a ruling, and some things prevent the ruling. So these are very important to look at. Following that, we will look at what constitutes a sound action. What makes an action sahih, that we can say in the Sharia it checks all of the boxes, it's a sound action. And then we're going to look at, of course, and by the way, in the discussion of the sound action, we're also going to look at the differences between the mutakallimun and the fuqaha, the Shafi'is, Malikis, Hanbalis, and the Ahnaf on this issue. Then we're going to look at what happens for an action to be considered that it's fulfilled. We can say, okay, this action has been fulfilled. And then we are going to look at invalid acts that are invalid. In this we are going to learn about the difference of opinion between our madhab and the fuqaha madhab on the issue of something that is fasid and batil. For us they are the same word, they're synonyms as is in the text, but for the fuqaha, the ahnaf, it's different. Then we are going to look at performing an act of worship and then making up an act of worship, performing an act of worship in its time and having to make up an act of worship after its time. And then we are going to conclude with the lengthy discussion on dispensations, al-azim, al-rukhas, and then the unchanged determined act, the azima. So an act that you take a dispensation for, or the act that's unchanged and you do it completely. These are the main topics that we're going to talk about inshallah in today's lecture. So we will begin the way I have been beginning in this course, which is to turn, indeed all the courses, to turn to the original text, inshallah, so we can get used to hearing that. And as I said, we will begin with the causes and move on from there. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. قال المصنف رحمه الله ونفعنا بعلومه في الدارين آمين والسبب وصف ظاهر منضبط معرف للحكم. So causes are describable, exterior, measurable, and defining of the ruling. So, and by the way, this definition of the cause, of the sabab, is also basically the same definition of the illah, the ratio legis, the reason behind the law, that we will come and talk about in the section of qiyas, which is really, qiyas is like the heart. All of the chapters of Usul al Fiqh are important, but qiyas is really where all of it comes together, analogy. So, he says, the causes are describable, wasfun, so you have to be able to describe it. So if you find something and you're not able to articulate and describe it, then it's not considered the cause. Exterior, so it's not something that's inherent to the act itself. So in this case, think of the movement of the sun from the zawal, from the topmost part of the sky towards the west, the zawal being the beginning of Salat al-Dhuhr. So the time in which Salat al-Dhuhr, this is a cause. The movement of the sun slightly towards the descent in the west is the cause for the beginning of Salat al-Dhuhr. So you can describe that. It's exterior to the prayer. It's not part of the prayer. It's measurable. I mean, literally it's measurable. The beginning of the chapter of prayer in almost any book of fiqh is mawaqitu salah, the times of the prayer. So you actually can measure with the shadow, and we talked about that in the fiqh class. Mu'arrafun lil hukmi. So it describes the ruling. In this case, the example that I just gave, the ruling is the beginning of Salatul Dhuhr. I mean, you could say the same thing for the birth of the new moon for any new month, or more importantly, let's say for the month of Ramadan, because based on sighting the new moon, that's when we're going to start to pray. So again, it's something that's describable. You can describe what the new crescent moon looks like. It's exterior to the fast, because the Prophet ﷺ said, "Sumu li ru'yatihi wa aftiru li ru'yatihi." So you're going to fast based on seeing the birth of the new moon. So it's exterior to the fast itself. It's not part of the fast. It's measurable. You get the telescopes out, you see it in the sky, you take pictures, and then it defines the ruling. It defines why it becomes obligatory. Okay, and as I said, we will come to learn later that this is what we refer to as al-illah. Okay, and then he says, rahimahullah, الشرط وشرط ما يلزم من عدمه العدم ولا يلزم من وجوده وجود ولا عدم. And the conditions are that which are conditions are that which their non-existence necessitate non-existence of the ruling, but their existence does not necessitate or obviate the ruling. So, a condition to pay your zakah is that you have to, the year has to pass, al-hawl. So, its non-existence means non-existence of the ruling. So if you have nisab, the minimal zakatable amount, but you don't have the year that's passed, then there is no zakah. So the non-existence of the condition necessitates the non-existence of the ruling, because it's a condition. But the existence of the condition does not necessarily mean the existence or the ruling or the passing of or the non-existence of the ruling, because a hawl might have passed and you have money, but it hasn't reached the nisab. So just because a condition exists, it doesn't mean that the ruling is going to exist. But if the condition does not exist, then the ruling itself does not exist. I hope that that's clear. He also says in the commentary that the conditions can be aqli, can be a rational condition, like having life in order to gain knowledge. Being alive is obviously a condition to having knowledge. It can be shara'i, it can be a sharia condition, like you have to have tahara for prayer. That's another example. If I don't have tahara, I cannot pray. But if I have tahara, it doesn't mean that I have to pray. Like right now, I can be in a state of tahara, but there's no fard for me to pray. So the existence of the condition does not necessarily mean the ruling. But if I don't have the prayer tahara, I can't pray. So conditions can also be shara'i. They can be adi. They can be natural, such as needing to build stairs. He says needing to build stairs to be able to go to the rooftop. Conditions can also be linguistic, lughawi. He says, akrim fulanan in ja'a. Honor this person when he comes. So you've created a condition when he comes, linguistically, then you're going to honor him. And then all of these we'll pick up later, inshallah. Okay, so those are conditions, and then the last of the ahkam al-wada'iyya are the preventions. So he says, rahimahullah, وَالْمَانِعُ وَصْفٌ وُجُودِيٌّ ظَاهِرٌ مُنْضَبِطٌ مُعَرِّفٌ نَقِيدَ الْحُكْمِ كَالْقَتْلِ فِي الْإِرْثِ. And he says preventions are describable, exterior, measurable, and defining the opposite of the ruling, like killing being a prevention of inheritance. This is actually in the text, this is not from the commentary. So what does that mean? And we have the hadith that the Prophet ﷺ said, Al-qatilu la yarith. So if somebody kills, we shudder to even say a parent or a grandparent or a spouse or somebody that they would inherit from, the act of killing such a person prevents them from inheriting. So in this case, the qatl in this case is the preventative thing that prevents the ruling, which is the inheritance, for happening. So let's go back to the beginning. He says, again, it's describable. So notice how describable is something that we're going to find in all three, because again, Usul al Fiqh is a super precise instrument. If fiqh is a precise instrument, then Usul al Fiqh is a super precise microscopic instrument. Things must be definable. So when things are definable, then they're known, and then there's no ambiguity or doubt, and so on and so forth. So it has to be describable. It's exterior, like in the case, the example that he gives, killing, preventing inheritance. It's something that's outside of the rules of inheritance. It has to be measurable. You can define it, you can measure it in the cases that things need to be measured. And it defines the opposite of the ruling, so it prevents you from carrying out the ruling. Okay, I think that that's pretty clear, inshallah. Let me see if there's any examples that are worth mentioning. Okay, I think a lot of these things he mentions in the commentary that we'll pick them up when we get to Mabhath al-Illa, the section on Illa, which is going to come much. It's not in this module. I think it'll be in the second or third. I can't remember, but it will come later in the book. Is the important thing. Okay, so just a quick pause to say that what have we been doing? So we talked about. Other than the initial theological things like God's speech and things like that, we talked about the five ahkam of the Sharia. That something is either obligatory or haram, recommended, disliked, or neutral. Those are the five ahkam of the Sharia, and then we add to those the three ahkam al-wada'iyya that we just talked about now, causes, conditions, and preventions. And the two other is that the act can be sound or the act can not sound. That's what the next discussion is going to be. So these 10, when we talk about al-hukm al-shar'i, when we talk about the Sharia ruling, we're always talking about these 10. The 5 that govern the act, the 2 that say the act can be completely sound or not completely sound, and the 3 established rulings, al-ahkam al-wada'iyya, that Allah Ta'ala has established that something is either a cause or a prevention or a condition. So to complete those 10, now we are going to talk about sound actions, and then obviously implied by that are actions that are not sound. What makes the act itself complete and sound and checks the boxes, and then you don't have to worry about it, or what makes the actions not sound? We'll pick up this discussion inshallah in the next clip. Alright, so sound actions. He says rahimahullah, وَالصِّحَّةُ موافقة ذي الوجهين الشرع في الأصح وبصحة العبادة إجزاؤها أي كفايتها في سقوط التعبد في الأصح وغيرها ترتب أثره ويختص الإجزاء بالمطلوب في الأصح. So he says rahimahullah, sound actions are those actions that can comply with both sides of the Sharia, that is compliance and non-compliance, as opposed to issues which can only have compliance, such as knowledge of God, since its opposite is ignorant. So, what does that mean? For an action to be sahih, the action is sound. That action has to have two sides of the Sharia. In other words, that action can either be an action that you comply with or you don't comply with. You either prayed dhuhr or you didn't pray dhuhr. You either fasted Ramadan or you didn't fast Ramadan. That's al-wajhain. He says dhil wajhaini ash-shara. So this is in the dominant position. This is the definition that we have in our madhab of usul of what a sound action is that the action has to be compliable or compatible with both sides. You can't say that in an action like knowledge of God is sahih because the opposite of it is not going to be fasid or batil, it's going to just be ignorance. So that only has one side. either you understand Allah Ta'ala and you know God, or you're just in a state of ignorance. But in the acts of worship, the act can be sahih or it can be corrupt. It can be complete or it can be incomplete, because there's two sides to the compliance issue. So sound actions are those actions that can comply with both sides of the Sharia, meaning that is compliance and non-compliance, as opposed to issues which can only have compliance, such as knowledge of God. So in other words, you can't not have knowledge of God and say that that's the opposite of knowledge. There's no two sides to that. It's either you're right or you are wrong and ignorant. Okay, and then he says, sound acts of worship mean that the act suffices the one doing it, and they have fulfilled their obligation in the dominant opinion. وبصحة العبادة إجزاؤها أي كفايتها في سقوط التعبد في الأصح. So, sound acts of worship mean that the act suffices the one doing it. So I've prayed Salatul Dhuhr on time, with wudu, facing the Qibla, with all of the arkan of prayers. We say that that act of worship is sound, so it suffices me, and I have fulfilled my obligation. This is the definition in the dominant opinion. The less dominant opinion, or the lesser opinion, is that it means sahih act is that I don't have to make a qada, I don't have to make it up, which is just a weaker phraseology or definition. And then he says, وَغَيْرِهَا تَرَتُّبُ أَثَرِهِ. As for non-acts of worship, the soundness of the act follows its relationship to other matters related to it. So, if I have like a tahir object and I'm buying or I'm selling it, and we do the ijab and qubul, we'll say that the act, the transaction is, the bay'ah is sahih, and therefore all of the things, the derivatives of that thing that follow from it, follow. Such as we have 3 days to rescind, we have the majlis al-aqd, we have the gathering in which the contract is taking place. You can choose not to accept it at that point, and then when you leave, then it becomes obligatory to exchange, so on and so forth. All of those things that are derivatives. So he says, as for, I translated it this way, as for non-acts of worship, the soundness of the act, in this case I gave you an example of like a contract, follows its relations to other matters related to it. So you have a sahih aqd of nikah, then therefore there's going to be the mahr is obligatory, the arkan of the contract, you have to have the witnesses, you have to have the wali, etc. And then therefore sexual relations become permissible and so on. And nasab is established if there's lineage, is established if there's children as a result, etc., etc., etc. Okay? So let me just read those two paragraphs again, because it's a longer definition than the other ones. Sound actions are those actions that can comply with both sides of the Sharia, that is compliance and non-compliance, as opposed to issues which can only have one compliance, can only have compliance, such as knowledge of God, since its opposite is ignorance. Sound acts of worship mean the act suffices the one doing it, and they have fulfilled their obligation in the dominant opinion. As for non-acts of worship, the soundness of the act follows its relations to other matters related to it. Okay. Then he says, وَيَخْتَصُّ الْإِجْزَاءُ بِالْمَطْلُوبِ فِي الْأَصَحِ. In the dominant position, fulfilling an act relates only to obligatory and recommended acts. In a weaker position, وَقِيلَ يَخْتَصُ بِالْوَاجِبِ. In a weaker position, it only relates to obligatory acts. So when we say fulfilling an act, the ijza, we are talking about obligatory acts and recommended and sunnah acts. So today is Thursday, I want to fast. I fasted the day successfully with all of its conditions. Then we say I have fulfilled the act. I have done the ijza of the act. And then he says, وَيُقَابِلُهَا الْبُطْلَانُ وَهُوَ الْفَسَادُ فِي الْأَصَحِّ وَالْخُلْفُ لَفْظِيٌّ. And then he says, invalid acts. So now we've talked about fulfilling the act. Well, what invalidates the act? Invalid acts are those that are corrupt, fasid. The dominant opinion is that these two terms are synonymous. So for us, batil and fasid are the same. However, and this is something that we need to note because it's quite significant, for the Hanafis, the fuqaha, in the usul, they are different. So what is the difference for the Hanafis? If the act is against the Sharia, such that there is a prohibition for that act, the original act is prohibited against, the Hanafis call that butlan. But if there is a description that the act is by default correct, but there's something wrong in that act, they call it fasid. So the batil and the fasid are two different things for them. The example that he gives, for example, is fasting Yawm al-Nahr, the day of Nahr. Or I guess a better example is selling 1 dirham for 2 dirhams, which is a ribawi. We would say it's batil and fasid. So they would say it's fasid, it's not batil, because there is the permissibility of trade of dirham, but there is a description in this particular trade, which is that it's ribawi, that is exterior to the main concept of trade or buying and selling, which is permissible. So they are able to differentiate, particularly when it comes to transactions, between al-aqd al-batil and al-aqd al-fasid, the contract that is batil, invalid, and the contract that is corrupt. For us, they're synonymous. So for us, we would say buying and selling a dirham for dirhamin is batil and fasid. It's the same thing. They would say no, it's not batil, it's fasid, because there is an exterior description to the contract, because you can sell a dirham for a dirham or a dinar for a dinar, but you can't have it in inequitable amounts, because that's the textbook definition of a ribawi transaction. Pick up the discussion in the next clip. Okay, so in the last clip I was talking about that for us, invalid acts are those that are corrupt, fasid, and the dominant opinion is that these two terms are synonymous. However, I was commenting on from the text we have in the Sharh of Shaykh al-Islam that the Hanafis argue differently. That they argue that a batil act is an act that it's in its essence, in its description, in its essence is not permissible. Like not praying with all of like without wudu or something like that. Well, the whole thing is batil, because it's by definition you have to have the prayer. But if there's something exterior, a wasf, like the ribawi transaction of buying 1 dirham for 2 dirhams or buying 1 dinar for 2 dinars, etc., they will say the transaction can be sound, but it can be fasid because there's something exterior to it. So this is not the place for us to get into more detail. I just highlight it for you, but you will find these differences when we talk about transactions. And then he says, rahimahullah, وَالْأَصَحُ أَنَّ الْأَدَاءَ فِعْلُ الْعِبَادَةِ أَوْ رَكْعَةٍ فِي وَقْتِهَا وَهُوَ زَمَنٌ مُقَدَّرٌ لَهَا شَرْعًا. Performing an act of worship. The dominant opinion is that performing an act of worship or 1 unit of prayer in the time allotted for this act by the Sharia. The dominant opinion is that performing an act of worship or one unit of prayer in the time allotted for this act by the Sharia. And this comes from the hadith of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. In the Sahihain, "Man adraka rak'atan min as-salati faqad adraka as-salah." Whoever, this is on the authority of, okay, I don't have the takhrij of it, but it's in the Sahih, it's Bukhari and Muslim. The Prophet ﷺ said, whoever prays one whole unit, one rak'ah, in the time, and then you stand, like let's say you're praying dhuhr, at the very end of dhuhr, you've got the first rak'ah of dhuhr, and then when you stand up, you hear the adhan for Salat al-Asr. Because you got the first rak'ah in the time of dhuhr, the next three rak'ahs will follow the sahihness of that first rak'ah. So for us, we call that ada. So he says, the dominant opinion, and the dominant definition for us is that performing an act of worship, and we always use the salah because of this hadith as the example, or one unit of prayer, one rak'ah in the time, means you do it in the time allotted for this act by the Sharia. The Sharia is the one, meaning Allah Ta'ala and Rasulullah SAW, that have defined the times of the prayer for us. Now, that's performing the act. If you perform that act, then you don't have to make up that act, you have fulfilled your obligation. And opposed to that is al-qada, when you have to make up the act. So he says, وَأَنَّ الْقَضَاءَ فِعْلُهَا أَوْ إِلَّا دُونَ رَكْعَةٍ بَعْدَ وَقْتِهَا تَدَارُكًا لِمَا سَبَقَ لِفِعْلِهِ مُقْتَدٍ. Making up an act of worship is performing the act of worship or less than a whole unit of prayer after the time, as it pertains to the same act previously acted upon by legally responsible people, a legally responsible person, whether by way of the act being obligatory or recommended. So this act, previously we did it, it was either an obligatory act or a sunnah act, and we had to do it in a certain time. So if we do it outside of the time, basically it's the opposite definition. I mean, I know that the definition is a little technical and clunky, but it means the opposite of what we just said, performing the act. So let me read that again. Making up an act of worship is performing the act of worship or less than one whole unit of prayer after the time that's been given to it by the Sharia, as it pertains to that same act previously acted upon by a legally responsible person. So a mukallaf did the same act before with its conditions, and it was either an obligatory or a recommended act. And then he says, وَأَنَّ الْإِعَادَةَ فِعْلُهَا وَقْتَهَا ثَانِيًا مُطْلَقًا. As for repeating an act of worship, it is to perform the act a second time generally. Whether you are repeating the act in its time, like you prayed dhuhr, and then your sheikh comes to the mosque and you go, oh, I want to pray with the sheikh. Or I prayed dhuhr at home and then I go to the mosque and all of my friends and students are praying, I want to pray again with them. So that's i'ad, I'm praying it again. Or I pray again because I missed the prayer. So that's why he says mutlaqan, and I translate it as generally. So repeating an act of worship is to perform the act a second time generally. Okay, and now lastly, dispensations and unchanged determined acts. وَالْحُكْمُ إِن تَغَيَّرَ إِلَى سُهُولَةٍ لِعُذْرٍ مَعَ قِيَامِ السَّبَبِ لِلْحُكْمِ الْأَصْلِي فَرُخْصَةٌ واجبة ومندوبة ومباحة وخلاف الأولى كأكل ميتة وقصر بشرطه وسلم وفطر مسافر لا يضره الصوم وإلا فالعزيمة. Then he says, let's get my translation here. A dispensation, a rukhsa, is when a ruling changes to an easier version due to some excuse, while the original cause of the ruling remains. So you can shorten your prayers when you're traveling, but the original default of the prayer is that it's full 4 rakahs. So the original ruling remains. If the original ruling does not remain, then we call that naskh, abrogation. That's going to come later. This dispensation can either be obligatory, recommended, permissible, opposed to what is preferable. Okay, so it follows, the rukhsa can follow these ahkam. A lot of people that are into tasawwuf and into the ethical dimension of Islam, they oftentimes don't realize that a rukhsa, because in the ethical sense, the rukhsa can be like a derogatory thing. Oh, you're taking the rukhsa, you have to take the azima, the hard thing, and be hard on yourself. Yes, but sometimes you have to take the rukhsa. And that's why he gives us these examples. These examples, by the way, are from the metan that we just read, not from the sharh or the hashiyah. The dispensation can either be obligatory, recommended, permissible, or opposed to what is preferable, such as eating meats killed and not slaughtered out of necessity. So, necessity of preserving life. So this is an obligatory, like you're about to die and all you have is haram meat, you got to eat it to sustain yourself. Shortening the prayer with their conditions, this is recommended. In traveling. Engaging in the salam transactions, buying something with guaranteed attributes, it's permissible, it's jaiz. We talked about a salam, bay'u shay'un mawsufun fi dhimma in the Kitab al-Buyu' al-Mu'amalat. And breaking one's fast while traveling when the fast does not cause any harm, it is opposed to what is preferable. So when you're traveling and you're fasting, unless the fasting is like killing you or harming you, it's better, that's the example we gave in the previous 2 lectures ago in Khilaf al-Awla, it's better to keep fasting. But you can break your fast. So here you can see that the rukhas are different. And then he says, to complete an act according to its original ruling is to perform an unchanged, determined act. And that's how I translated azima, because it means that the act has not been changed. Because the definition of the rukhsa is that the ruling changes due to some excuse. So here the azima would be unchanged and you are determined to carry out the act in its fullest. So, this is about dispensations and determined acts. Let me see if there's anything in the commentary that I wanted to bring up for you. Well, one thing that's important to note is notice that there's no rukhsa that's haram. Okay, because then that would be like kind of like an oxymoron. So the rukhsa means that you are allowed to do it, but it's varying degrees of permissibility. So either you have to do it, it's recommended that you do it, or it's not so recommended that you do it. But there's no, it's haram to do it, or then it wouldn't be a rukhsa, then it would be an act of halal and haram, or sihhatu wal butlan, or either the act is sound or not sound. So that's on something that's important to mention. So when you come across the concept of the rukhsa or the dispensation, it's important that you ask yourself what is the reason behind the dispensation, so you can understand where it falls in the ruling. And this is where I think the people in the tasawwuf side of things can benefit from the fuqaha and the usul, and also the people on the usul can do a service by highlighting these things so that people don't think just because you engage in a rukhsa and a dispensation you're somehow like a weaker of a Muslim. Because if something is valid and permissible, that means you're following the Sharia. So how can following the Sharia lead to an unethical life? It kind of creates like a problem. So this is one of those subjects that's I think important. Wallahu ta'ala a'la wa a'lam wa sallallahu ala sayyidina wa maulana Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Alhamdulillah, in today's class we discussed the following topics. We looked at the 3 ahkam al-wada'iyya, the established rulings, starting with causes, and then looking at conditions, and then looking at preventions. And then we looked at how an action can either be sound or not sound. So with the, I forgot, I gotta read it again. With the causes, conditions, preventions, sound and not sound, we add these 5 to the other 5 we talked about in the last class. The haram, the wajib, mandub, mubah, makruh, and then obviously khilaf awla, but it's like a subset of makruh. These 10 are the main ahkam, the main rulings that we always begin the discussion of Usul al Fiqh with. Then we looked at what fulfills an act and what means an act is, what causes an act to be fulfilled. And then we looked at invalid acts and corrupt acts, the batil and the fasid, that for us, the majority of the usulis, they're the same, they're synonyms, but we noted quite importantly that the Hanafis make a distinction between the batil and the fasid, particularly when it comes to contracts, uqud, which a contract can be valid but be fasid at the same time. Then we looked at performing an act of worship, what makes the act of worship valid, that it has been performed correctly in its time, and then what makes the act that it has not been performed correctly in its time. And then we also, as a derivative of that, we looked at making up acts of worship, the qada. And then lastly, we talked a little bit about, or we talked, what's based on the text, about dispensations, rukhas, and the azima, unchanged, determined acts. And we learned that the rukhas are things, dispensations that make the act less stringent, but the original act remains intact. And then therefore the rukhsa, the dispensation, can either be obligatory or recommended, or against what is preferable, khilaful awla. But there is no haram rukhsa, obviously, because that would be oxymoronic. And we looked at some of the examples that he gave us in the text to help us understand the distinction between, like, an obligatory rukhsa, you gotta eat something haram to sustain life, or you can break your fast when you're traveling, etc., etc. Those are the main topics that we talked about. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina wa Mawlana Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam.